Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Water Institute Water Talk. You should probably know me by now. My name is Roy Brouwer. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo. I want to start by acknowledging that we're participating today from traditional territories of the First People. You can see where we are here on this map. I participate today from land that is part of the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And on the map, as I said, you can see we are located on land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River as part of the Haldeman Treaty that was signed in 1784. University of Waterloo and its centers and institutes like the Water Institute are committed to raise awareness and contribute to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls for action. And I encourage all of you here with us online to take a moment to recognize the traditional land where you are. Before I introduce today's speaker, just a few housekeeping items. You can add your questions to the Q&A box. Just use the Q&A box, not the chat box, please. And you can do this at any time throughout the talk. And then the speaker will get to those after the talk, or I will help him during the talk if there are any questions of clarification. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the Water Institute's YouTube channel afterwards, so you can watch it again later as well. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Fabio Pulizzi, Chief Editor of the new Nature Water Journal. Fabio joined Nature Water as Chief Editor in January 2022, after working 16 years already at various nature research journals. He joined Nature Materials as an associate editor in January 2006 and handled manuscripts in materials physics. In July 2012, he became the chief editor of Nature Nanotechnology, and he did that for almost 10 years. He developed during those 10 years an interest for environmental issues and extended the scope of the journal to cover environmental nanotechnology, nanotechnology applications in clean water and sustainable agriculture, as well as regulations of engineered nanomaterials. In 2020, he worked on the launch of Nature Water, and he was appointed to lead the editorial team. Fabio has a degree in physics from the University La Sapienza in Rome in Italy and a PhD in physics from the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And between 2002 and 2006, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Nottingham and at the University of Sheffield in the UK. Fabio is based in London in the UK. And in his today's talk, Fabio will share his vision with us on this exciting new journal. Fabio, we're very happy to have you here with us today. Even though it's virtual, I'm happy to open the floor to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, because this is a fantastic opportunity. I always say this when I give a talk, that for us it's very important to talk to people, because we do. I'll start sharing my screen and my presentation in the meantime. That we spend our life sitting behind the screen and reading papers and trying to take decision on those. And there is a moment in which you realize that you are kind of getting too detached from research. And that's why we keep talking to people. We keep visiting labs or institutes. We keep going to conferences. We want to let people know how we do what we do, but also we want to learn about the everyday challenges of research, because at the end of the day, when you read the paper, as we all know, the paper is only one, I would say even one small part of the research. It's something that we use to judge research more than to and to communicate it. But the way research is carried out is something else, and the challenges are all different. So thanks again for having me here today. So what I'm going to do is, indeed, I just want to introduce the journal, what we think about it. So what is my vision, but which is now shared with my editorial team, who have joined me since a few months already. And the first thing I want to do is actually, when I'm thinking about the journal, it's always very difficult sometimes to use your own words. And I like to use the words of Sandra Postel. That there's a quote that I taken from her book Replenish, and I use this quote because for me it's almost exactly what the journal wants to be. It's really about the way in which the relationship between society and water resources has evolved in the history, and what it is now and what will be in the future. And we really are looking at publishing a journal which publishes results from all disciplines that have to do with water. And ideally, we're looking at the contributions of interdisciplinary research whenever it's possible, going from natural sciences to engineering and to the social sciences as well. So I've divided the talk in 3 main chapters, let's call it like that. One is a little introduction to Nature Water and how it fits in within the so-called Nature portfolio, which is basically Nature and the other Nature journals. Then I will stay a little bit on the scope of Nature Water, in the sense that I will describe what are the areas that, the big areas that we want to publish. And I'll give you some examples of papers that have been published, not by us, of course, because we will start publishing in January 23, but by other Nature journals, and that somehow fit within the scope of what we want to do. And I will finish with actually 1 slide only on the editorial process, which this is common to all the Nature journals, but there are a couple of things that I wanted to highlight that are specific to Nature Water, particularly regarding times. So I get started with the first part. So what is a Nature journal, and what does it mean, and what makes a Nature journal, if you like? So every Nature journal, Nature itself, is 150 years old and a bit more, actually. Now I think it's 152 at the moment. When in 53, in fact, it was 69 when it was launched, 1869. So each of these journals is very selective. So basically, we only publish a very small portion of the papers that we receive. And this is something, just to give you some numbers, when I was in Nature Technology, and I've been there, as Roy said, for about 10 years, we used to publish about 7% of all the papers that we received. And by doing this, what we're trying to do is publish papers that are likely to have impact. Now, when we talk about impact, I want to say this very clearly from now, we're not talking about impact factor. So impact is really what we're thinking of, it's how those results that we publish are going to impact research further, and ideally even society. For certain journals particularly, that's more important. So we are not, what I'm trying to say is that we are not looking at papers that are likely to be cited. I'm trying to say, I'm highlighting this because very often it seems like we get this kind of criticism whether we only publish papers that we know are going to be cited. We are trying to publish papers that will have influence on research. Then, of course, if we are right, if we do something right, if those papers really are likely to have influence, they might also get high citations, and that will lead to a high impact factor. But it's not the criterion. The criterion is to imagine as editors whether the results that we see are going to be impactful. Each of the Nature journals is independent, is run by a full-time or professional editors. So we are all professionals. I stopped in 2005 being a scientist, and I became an editor, and that's my full-time job. But each journal as well is independent from the others, meaning that, of course, we share the offices, we share the policies, we're part of the same company, and we talk to each other about science, about, as I said, about policy particularly. But we don't talk specifically about papers, in the sense that if a paper is in consideration of one of the journals, somebody at another journal doesn't have access to the system, to the manuscript system, so they do not know that we have the manuscript. And if we take a decision on a manuscript that is negative, that doesn't mean that another journal would also take the same decision. There is one exception to the situation of not talking about papers, and I will go into that later, but it still doesn't preclude the independence. So what is it that we try to publish? As I said, so we want to publish something of impact. So it has to be original and technically sound, although I would say that that's kind of a necessary condition, not a sufficient one, in the sense that at the end of the day, everything has to be technically sound to be published in any journal, right? But we want to have something which is a substantial advance, which is conceptually novel, which is an unexpected discovery. More generally, that it's of broad interest or is practical applicability. All of these things are very nice words, but sometimes it's difficult to imagine what they actually mean. And there isn't a real, very, very specific way of saying it, more than the reality is that the way we see it is that for us, the results that we publish have to be so significant within a certain field that even people in other fields will be able to appreciate that they're significant. So it doesn't mean that they will have to use them in their own research, but they will be able to understand that, you know, the field was at some point here, and now after these results, this is, let's say, it's a little bit higher at the level of advance. And I will give you some examples later, hopefully that will help understanding what I mean. So in terms of how the Nature portfolio works, so there's Nature, if you look, if we plot them, let's say the journals in reverse order of significance of the results published, we have Nature at the top, the Nature Research Journals, of which Nature Water is one. Then there is Nature Communications, Communication Journals, and the scientific reports. So Nature Communications publishes the same spread of the same breadth of topics that Nature does, but there is not so much emphasis on this broad interest, let's say. And the communication journals and the scientific report are not as such nature journals in the sense that they also have an external editorial board that helps the editors, while Nature, the Nature journals, and Nature Communications all have full-time editors, only full-time editors taking decisions. And one thing to mention is that there's a lot of talk about open access at the moment, so I think it's important to remark this, that while Nature Communication Journals, and scientific reports are all fully open access, Nature and Editorial Research Journals are so-called transformative journals, in the sense that they are currently hybrid. So if authors want to publish open access, they can. And with the idea is that if at some point the uptake of open access is very high, they might switch to be fully open access, but at the moment they're hybrid. So what is Nature Water for us? We really wanted it. I've already used exactly these words. It's a thematic journal covering the evolving relationship between society and water resources. As we know, water is one of the big challenges of society, and at least in my perspective, is going to become probably one of the most important, if not, well, not just one of the most important, the most important, also the basis of other big challenges like food and energy, for example. But also, it's got a relationship with other big challenges like equality, like gender equality and inequalities more generally, and poverty, and so on. So we want to publish in the natural sciences, engineering, and social sciences. So earth sciences and environmental science, but also environmental engineering, civil engineering, chemical material engineering. And when we talk about social sciences, we're referring to economics, but also human geography, sociology, behavioral disciplines more generally. So what we want to do is publish results that are going to have an impact either on the fundamental understanding or in the applicability of the practical applicability, whether they are technological or societal. For example, we can think about policy implementation and so on. In a way, this is, let's say, an evolution of the Nature journals the way they used to be, in the sense that Nature Water is not the only one that is doing this, but traditionally Nature journals has always looked primarily a fundamental advance. The classical thing that an editor at a Nature journal would be looking for would be the conceptual advance. For us, this is not the only criterion. For us is also, we want to, if there is no real conceptual advance in some results, but it's a technological work that could potentially lead to practical implementations, practical application, I should say, that could still be of relevance for us, and the same for societal impact. As I said, we start publishing the 1st of January, well, in January 2023. That date is not decided yet, but it will be in the first half of January 2023. The team has 4 editors at the moment, like most launching journals. That's me, of course, on the left 5 years ago. So I've already, I don't look like that picture anymore, I guess. The other 3 associates are all environmental engineer by training. So, but they have then specialized in different aspects. So Yanhua is based in Shanghai. She did a degree at ETH, and then she got a PhD from the Post-Sharing Institute in combination with the University of Bern. And so she's an environmental engineer by, let's say, she has a bachelor in environmental engineer, but she did a PhD in earth sciences, and she is now responsible for all water resources science, including, for example, hydrology, limnology, climate change effects, and so on. Xujian Zhang is, she got a PhD from the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, And she's also an environmental engineer, but with, let's say, a focus more on the chemical engineering part of it. So she's been working primarily on oxidative processes in organic pollution remediation, and she is a person in charge of water, wastewater treatment and pollution remediation. And Karin Sjöstrand got a degree in Lund, and she then did a PhD in Chalmers University, and she's worked for many years at the RISE Institute of Technology the RISE Institute in Stockholm. Working in collaboration with utility companies and with government, local government. So she has worked a lot on risk assessment, on governance, and on policies as well. More recently, she worked also at the Stevens Institute, but only for about 3 months before she joined at the end of April. And so hopefully, hopefully the journal will grow, and we will get more editors in the editorial team. So when we talk about the scope, usually we use keywords, right, to show all whatever that we want to publish. And if you go on our website, you'll notice that there are keywords there, but it's very limiting and kind of not really fair to describe it just with keywords, what we want to publish. So we kind of set together with a team and come up with an idea or with a description by using big thematic areas. For example, the first one is definitely water resources research, which is, of course, is more fundamental, hydrology, hydrogeology, and so on, but also and flooding and drought. So also part of what climate change does to water resources. But we also think about, for example, the effects of pollution and so on, the effect of infrastructure as well on the water resources. Then, of course, is water and wastewater treatment, which is primarily engineering, I would say, or at least chemistry, if you like. So we're talking about, creating treatment process for clean drinking water, but also wastewater treatment and pollution remediation and so on. We're interested, of course, in the nexus with energy and food and climate. And what I mean by this is, of course, we're looking at water for irrigation, but also the consumption in food, virtual water for the production of other products. But we're also thinking about, for example, let's say the carbon emission related to the water sector and the effect that therefore it has on climate change. One of the aspects that I particularly I'm interested to cover in the journal is the relationship with public health. So when I'm thinking about both the safe drinking water, but also sanitation, of course, and hygiene. But I'm also thinking about research in wastewater epidemiology, which, as we know, has become particularly relevant in times of COVID. But we would be interested to see how this evolves and whether this will be important for other types of infectious diseases and so on. A more general area, this is very difficult to actually describe because it's so broad, is the water resources, planning, management, so governance, policies, economics, and so on. And finally, there's an aspect of water and society that we want to cover, which is, for example, all the aspects of water justice, also of acceptability of technology, public acceptance of technology, of conflicts, and so on. So as I said, we come up with some of the papers that we think could be used to describe the scope, even if I must say, one of the reasons why we think nature water is needed is because not everything which is relevant for water research is published by Nature already, and we want to create a journal that covers some of those areas, so there will be overlap with some other journals, but really publishes a lot of also topics that are not necessarily considered at the moment. So talking about water resources research, this is a paper that was published in Climate Change, for example, and it's really a big survey about the patterns and dynamics of climate-groundwater interaction, or how climate affects groundwater. So I'm not going to go into the details of the papers, just to show you what the big themes are. So this is relatively fundamental as a type of study. The next one is looking more at the impact of human infrastructure. So this is looking at the barriers that have been, and how the barriers have been created on rivers, and what is the effect on rivers. And with barriers, we mean, of course, dams, but also river crossings, and as well as output use or water use for irrigation, for example. And the third paper is still about water resources, but looking more at the pollution. So this is about microplastic contamination, and it's about let's say the different ability, or depending on the stream flow, on releasing microplastic and dispersing microplastic in the environment. If we go into the wastewater treatment, I chose this paper that I actually handled myself when I was in engineering technology, because it has a relatively fundamental aspect, and I wanted to show you this so this is a paper on artificial water channels, or artificial aquaporins. These type of membranes are one of the various types of membranes that are considered for water treatment. And in this particular case, the authors were looking at the fundamental way in which the water channels form during for the performance of the membrane, and in particular, they postulated a so-called dynamic formation, creation, and destruction of water channels. And so, as I said, of course, there is an impact eventually on the performance of the membranes, on the efficiency and performance of the membranes, but the type of work is relatively fundamental. And we definitely would be interested in this type of work, but we're also interested in work that is much more practical, has much more practical applicability. So this was a paper published in Nature Sustainability. And although the premise is relatively fundamental, because it looks at the single atom catalyst as the basis of organic wastewater treatment, it proposes a real, let's say, a design for a wastewater treatment plant based on this kind of process methodology. If we look at the water, energy, food, climate nexus, this was a paper in Nature Sustainability as well, which was looking at the effect of, let's say, combining agricultural feed with photovoltaic fields, and the effect that it has on soil and on water resources as well. But also regarding water and energy, this is a much more technological paper, which is about the simultaneous production of clean water and photovoltaic energy. And this is actually, it's quite a, let's say, a popular field. There's several research working on this field as well. And finally, this is a much more broad work on the effect of irrigation on the wheat and maize production at a global level. So I guess what I'm trying to do here is show you that we consider a big thematic area of the water, energy, food, and climate nexus, but there could be very different papers belonging to this thematic area. It's not very specific. When we look at water public health, I mentioned already the wastewater epidemiology used for COVID. Particularly, this is, as far as I could find, is the only paper that I saw published in Nature, even if there are plenty of papers published in other types of journals. And this was published in Nature Biotechnology already in 2020. Another one is, for example, is that the antibiotic-resistant gene and the effect of fecal pollution on antibiotic-resistant genes. So this paper was examining the relationship between the amount of fecal pollution and the development of antibiotic resistance. And in terms of planning and management, this is a paper on, exactly as the title says, flexibility and intensity of global water use. Again, it's a big survey, a big analysis of the situation at the global level, while the next one is much more related to urban water management. So this is more infrastructure at the local level, at the urban level, and it's about freshwater ecosystem services. And finally, when we talk about water in society, this is really about the economic impact of water scarcity, and it's very different in a way to the following one, which is instead about public perception and related to water. And in particular, this is a paper published in Geoscience, Nature Geoscience, about how the let's say the human effect on the changes in the water cycle is completely absent from, or almost completely absent from the perception of the public itself. So the public don't realize how much human actually the human intervention dominates the changes in the global water cycle. So this is it for this type of for the 6 thematic areas. I just put 2 more papers because I wanted to highlight something almost in response to some questions that we've had already from the beginning when we started talking about the journal, and it's whether we would be interested in publishing also research that is relatively local or regional, let's say. And the answer is that what we're interested in is results that are substantial advances. So it doesn't matter for us whether they are global or not. First of all, if it's a regional work that could have impact at the broader scale, we're definitely interested in that. But even if we don't get to that level, and even if we're talking about a regional work that is particularly important for the water situation in that region, we're still interested in that as well. So, okay, these 2 are relatively big areas, of course, big regions. This is about the Nile Basin. The next one is about the whole of China. But it's just to give an example and to highlight the fact that we are interested in regional work, because the situation with the research and the relationship with water is very much regional as well. So we cannot pretend to only consider work and research that has a relevance at the global level. I see that there is a question in, and I can already I can say that for the question is when does the journal open for submission, and I can tell you that is actually already open. It opened for submission last on the 18th of March, so we are already receiving submissions and we are sending them to review. What time frame for submission to publishing should we expect? That's an interesting question because I don't really know the answer exactly. My experience is that on average it takes about 6 months for a paper in a Nature journal, and a lot, of course, depends on the time it takes to us to take decisions and to reviewers to send the reports. But very often, in order to be published, the revisions are quite substantial. So it takes a long time also for authors to revise the papers. So in my experience, when I was in Nature Technology, the average was 6 months, and then it depends in a little bit on the fields as well. I'll actually go back to this point when I'm talking about the editorial processes. So aside from what I've discussed so far is all primarily about research papers, okay? But aside from the research papers, each Nature journal has what we call a front half, and it's a legacy of the fact that when journals used to be published in printed issues, the front part was, the first part was about non-primary research. So we can call this non-primary research articles. These can be comments, or other types of opinion pieces. So I gave some examples here. The first one on top left is actually a comment. So it's really an opinion of some experts in the field on a specific topic. And this was particularly about SDG 6. The second one is worldview, is something that not all Nature journals publish. Nature does, and we are very interested in this. And this was published in Nature. It's similar to a comment, but it's really written from a very personal perspective, in the sense that it's based on personal experience of the author, either life experience or work experience, but it's really related to how the author relates to the topic through their own personal experience. And as I said, not all journals publish these. We think that for water, it is a very appropriate type of publication. I should say the comments and worldview particularly will be primarily commissioned. So we will decide whom to contact. It doesn't mean that people cannot propose them something, but they tend to be commissioned. Comments, it's I would say 50% and 50%. It could happen that we just hear somebody talking about something and we ask them to write it down, or somebody might have an idea of a very strong opinion on something and propose it to us. We have complete 100%, let's say, decisional power on those, in the sense that unlike the papers that, for the papers we have decisional power, but we would simply decide based on the type of advance and the quality. For comments, perspective reviews, anything else that I'm talking about now, it's really about, do we want something about this topic now, or have we talked about this topic too often, and so on. So what I would say is that we are really open to submissions, but it's really completely our choice whether we want to publish something like that or not. Bottom left is news and views. This is kind of the staples of all nature journals. Nature and Nature journals. Science does something similar. I think they call them perspectives there. And it's really an article written by expert that has the aim of explaining to non-experts the importance of the results of a paper that we published in the journal. In this case, for example, this was about the paper on the artificial aquaporins that I showed you before. So it's a short articles, 800, 900 words, and is really is made to explain why the results are so important. Eventually, I put this down to business paper here that was published by Nature Reviews Physics, and as you can see, it's not about water. This is about quantum computing, but it's the best one that I think is the most influential that I've seen of this type. And the reason is that we are working on also on covering within Nature Water themes of commercialization of water issues. For example, looking at industrial advances, but also of let's say industry in terms of service provision in the water sector. And I do confess that we haven't actually defined exactly how we're going to cover let's say the beyond research type of work in the water sector, and hopefully we will do this by the beginning, but it's something that it's in the making, and if we don't publish it straight away, we will eventually. There's a question about that is very general. I will answer this if you don't mind. This is from Michael Tam. If you don't mind, I will wait till the end for this because it's a very broad question. So in terms of other non-primary research, obviously there's also perspectives and review articles. I will start with the review articles, which is on the right, is actually the easier one, in the sense that a review article is really an overview of development within a certain field during the last few years, with a look at how the field is evolving. And this is, in many ways, is similar to reviews published by others. Usually these are 5,000 to 6,000 words, and with 6 to 7, potentially 8 figures or display items anyway. The one on the left is more, the perspective is also grounded on existing literature, but is really more like a proposal, more like something that the authors are proposing for a certain field. So it's more grounded in literature than a comment would be, for example, but it's more of a personal view respect to a review articles. Now, both reviews and perspectives are peer-reviewed, like research papers. Well, they're formally peer-reviewed, obviously with a slightly different way of peer reviewing than research papers, because we are not looking at the validity of the research, but we are asking reviewers to help us deciding whether the results are balanced and the view is based on facts in the right way, and the views are not distorted, and so on. But unlike the non-primary research papers like comments and so on, those are not peer-reviewed almost at all. There are some exceptions in which, if there is a technical part, we might ask an expert to look at them, but more as a sanity check than an actual formal peer review. This takes me to the last part, which is the editorial process. And as I said, this is common to all nature journals. I just wanted to mention about the dates, the speed, which is something that we're aiming for, but we're not there yet, unfortunately. Well, first of all, of course, the editorial process, the first part is the submission of the manuscript, of course. When the manuscript is submitted, we have a cover letter, we can have review suggestion or request for exclusions. And I always tend to say that the cover letter is important. It's important primarily to explain to the editor why that journal is the right journal for that manuscript. That's really the main aim of the cover letter. And I say this because we find that very often the authors, let's say, overinterpret the importance of, overestimate the importance of the cover letter. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we decide on whether we consider the paper not from reading the paper, not from reading the cover letter. We will always read the paper. The cover letter is there to complement it, not to re-explain all the paper there, which is often what we find. For example, in my case, I very often, I would say basically every time, I would read the paper first and the cover letter afterwards, just to see if I missed anything. But the important part is the actual manuscript. I'm mentioning also reviewer suggestion and a request for exclusion. This is because they can be very helpful, reviewer suggestions particularly. We are not going to take them for granted. I mean, we're obviously going to check whether there's any collaboration or previous collaboration between the authors and the suggested reviewers, but they can be very helpful, and they also can be a good starting point to then look for other reviewers. Of course, there are cases. I have seen cases in 16 years where the authors would just suggest 10 people that they're all their previous postdocs or PhD students. That happens, and then we noticed that, so we wouldn't ask them. Request for exclusion is also okay. If I am asked to exclude some particular names, I have no reason not to do that. At the end of the day, I don't even need to know exactly why. It's possible that there are personal conflict between the author and these potential reviewers, and it's better to avoid them. Obviously, it has to be reasonable. I have had, again, requests of excluding 12, 15 people, and it becomes very difficult to find somebody who's really an expert. The most important thing, of course, is the last one, in fact, is the potential duplicate submission. With that, I mean that sometimes somebody might submit to another journal a manuscript at the same time, which has overlapping results, overlapping conclusions, and this could be fine, but we would want to see that. We would want to make sure that the overlap is not too much, particularly in the outcome of the papers, because then, in that case, we probably wouldn't be able to consider the paper in the first place. Now, the first decision is really deciding at all whether we would consider the paper from an editorial perspective. So this goes back to the criteria that I mentioned before about impact, about significance. So regardless of the quality, we need to decide whether we consider the paper at all. For an established journals, these numbers are, so the decisions are usually that about between 20 and 25% of manuscripts are considered and sent to reviews. For launching journal, it might be a little bit more, of course, because understanding that where we are, except in terms of the level that we want to publish, is more difficult. That our aim is to take this decision within 5 to 7 days. Eventually, I mean, I'm really keen that we do this, and the reason is that because we reject so many papers from the editor that we cannot really let people wait so long until they know whether that's submitted somewhere else. I'll say that this is our aim, and I'm hoping that we will get there. We're not there now, mostly because preparing for the launch takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And to be honest, my entire team is a team of new editors. They're all trained by myself, and so there is a kind of a delay due to the fact that we aim to interact several times on each paper, but the aim is that we're going to get there in the next few months, and we want to maintain it. It's extremely important for me. It has been for many years, so we really want to keep that level there. If we decide to send a paper to reviewers, we have to select the reviewers. Usually, we ask 3. It's possible sometimes to take a decision with 2 if we really don't manage to get a third one, but that 3 is our target. And the way in which we select reviewers is just by carefully looking around to find the right people. So we might look at the references, we might just base it on our knowledge of the field, we might use databases, or start from the reviewer suggestion from the authors. But important thing is that there is no real, shortcut. We need to find the people that are really going to be the right people. So, for example, if a paper has several aspects, we want to find experts that cover all of these aspects. And I would always say that, after all this time, I can see that this is probably the part of the process that takes the most, the longest time and the most effort. It is one of the most important moments. When we get the reports, we take the decision after review. And again, we're not there yet, but we want to aim for 40 to 45 days from the first submission, so including the 5 to 6, 7 days of the of our decision. Now, this is not always possible, but we would like to get that on average. And the way we take decisions is really looking at the arguments. So the responsibility of the decision is ours. It's not the reviewers. The reviewers are there to help us deciding, particularly from a technical perspective, the paper is correct or not. But in principle, and I'll explain why in principle, the decision on significance is ours. So if we decide to send the paper out, it's because we think that it's going to be significant. When I say in principle, is because it happens, of course, that after hearing from 3 reviewers, they might be happy with the technical validity, but they might all say that, frankly, this is not that important or not than new. At that point, we might decide that actually we have made a mistake in the first place. But what I'm saying is that eventually it's our responsibility. Either way, it's not something that we're going to let's say we cannot say the reviewer says that it's not important, therefore it's not important. Eventually, it's our decision to decide to choose whether we stick to what the reviewers say about the importance of the paper or not. The type of decision is usually either a reject. No, usually the reason why we reject the paper is because, rarely is because we overestimated the importance of the paper. More likely is because, in fact, from the reports, we figure out that the conclusions, even if important, are not actually supported by the results. That's typically what happens. And if it's a revised decision, it could be a long or short term. We call it, yes, the other way of thinking about this is minor or major corrections. But the reality is that, in some cases, is a matter of explaining things better, or rewriting something. In some cases, it's a matter of doing more work, more experiments, more calculations, and so on. But it's very rare that we take a decision within only one round. I think, again, it's happened. I've dealt with 5,000 papers in my editorial life, and I think it's happened to me once that the manuscript was ready after one round of review, in the sense that there was really nothing to change. And on average, I would say, I was saying before that it takes 6 months between this is between submissions and acceptance, not even between submission and publication. Publication takes a few more weeks. Now, we need to aim for less. We need to be, it's important for us, particularly at the launch, that we, that we make sure that reviewers respond. If they don't respond in time, we need to look for other reviewers and so on. Keeping in mind that reviewers are kind of helping us and doing us a favor in many ways. So we cannot be too strict and put too much pressure on them. There is a potential for appeal if the decision is negative. I can give more details if you're interested, but all I wanted to say at the moment is that there is no editorial board. As I was saying from the beginning, it's just an editorial team of fully independent editors. So if an author decides to appeal, the appeal goes back to us. So it's not like we are going to ask an editorial board member to help us decide. We might send it back to review or send it to review if it wasn't sent to review before. But the point is that we don't have any interest in rejecting a manuscript that in principle is valid and it's good. So we will have a look at it again, and we'll try to understand whether we underestimated the importance of a work, or whether, for example, it's possible that one of the reviewers got something wrong, and therefore the author is right in asking for it to be looked at again. But it's us doing this, not nobody else. These are things that I haven't discussed. So I talked a little bit about the relationship with the other journals, but not in details. I haven't talked at all about open data and open science more generally. I said something about appeals, as I said, but not too much into the details. I never talked about double-blind peer review, but also about other types of activities, I would say initiatives that we have at Nature to make peer review more transparent and broader. And then there are lots of other things, of course, that if you want to discuss, we can. This was just a little bit of publicity. And many ways, this is not to copy your WaterTalks, but is more to copy the Nature Nano Talks that I was doing when I was in Nature Nanotechnology. And this is a series of panel discussions that we started, in fact, 2 days ago. And we want to do once a month to discuss topics that are relevant for the journal with experts in the field, and they are free to attend and open to everyone. So the first one was last Tuesday, was about water and gender, and I think it was particularly good. You can access it if you want on this website. I'm hoping that we can put it on YouTube very soon. And I would like to invite you to keep an eye on our announcements on our webpage or on our Twitter account, because there's more coming. So the next one will be in second week of August, and it will be about Earth system to monitor particularly groundwater, but also surface water. And this is my last slide. Is really to thank you, but also to make sure that I make it very clear that when I give these talks, I realize I hear myself talking, and I realize how arrogant it might seem that we are there to decide what is really impactful, what is really significant. The reality is that as editors, we really are aware of the fact that science progresses with small steps and big steps. It's just that the type of the work that we do is to try to create a product that shows you mostly the big steps. But we also can be successful only if we get interesting papers from the authors, and we have the help from the referees. So it's the community at large that support us, and we are really, without that support from the community, we would fail. So thank you for being part of the community, and thank you also for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Fabio. We have around 10 minutes left for questions. I'm also going to start questioning you a little bit, Fabio, if you don't mind. So the video will be, or the talk will be recorded and put on video, but if you don't mind, share the link with Julie, then she can, to the talks in particular, if you want us to look at that. That would probably be helpful if we could put that in the chat. Sure. And as you saw, there was a question from Professor Michael Tam in the Q&A. Maybe we can start with that and then give other people who want to ask you a question a time to type in their question in the Q&A box.
Yes, I see the question. Thank you, Michael. It's a very difficult answer for me to give, and I'm sorry. I hope you don't think that I'm shirking responsibility, but in a way, I try to be a little bit like, I want to hear from the community what it is. I think that I don't know really what is the greatest challenge. I think that the challenge is to make sure that everyone has access to clean water as much as possible. And so there's something.
Atmospheric water harvesting.
No, sorry, I can see that there's that WaterTalks would like to answer this question live. Well, what does that mean? Sorry.
No, forget about that. No,
okay, all right.
Yeah, no. Michael also was asking whether there's interest in atmospheric water harvesting.
I'm interested, but personally, as in I am fascinated by it, let's say, and I'm fascinated. I started being fascinated especially when I was working more in the material science aspects of it. So I followed the work, for example, of Omayagi, this professor in California, and we will definitely consider it. I don't know. I think that there's conflicting opinions as to whether our how efficient it would be and how good it would actually be. I have the impression that particularly for places where there is really no infrastructures, we have to look at all possibilities. And for places where very high humidity and but they are isolated, you're talking about communities living in high altitude. I also think about communities living in more deserted areas where there is no infrastructure. It could be a way forward. Whether it will ever work in a sustainable way, I'm afraid I'm not really in the position to decide now, but I think it's certainly something that we will follow as a journal.
Thank you, Fabio. So the good news is we can actually already start submitting papers to the journal, is my understanding. We just have to go to the website. We just submit our research work. You also mentioned a little bit about commissioning perspectives or worldviews type of papers. So how does that work exactly? Is it you coming up with an idea, or can we also submit ideas for perspectives papers and then you commission us?
Yes. So the best way is that so you can, for perspectives and all for reviews as well, or for comments. Worldview, as I said, is slightly different because it's really more of a personal type of really from a personal perspective of an author rather than a scientific one. But everything, you can submit it if you have an idea. You can write to us by email, you can write to me by email, or we have our email, our general email is naturewater@nature.com, or you can directly submit it. The best thing if you submit it is to submit a synopsis. So basically that means we have a template for it, but it's not, we don't share it because the reality is that a lot of the synopsis is the template that we have is very, very extensive, and we don't really need all of that information. So what we need in a synopsis is the rationale of why that type of article is interesting, particularly why that in that moment, why in this moment. And so an abstract, say, of 200 words to describe the reason why that article is interesting. And then a kind of a breakdown of the sections you would include. Keeping in mind that the review, as I said, is about 5,000, 6,000 words. It can be a little bit more if needed, but that's the ballpark. A perspective is maybe 4,000 to 5,000, and the comment is about 2,000 words. But you can definitely do that. You can either send us a quick inquiry about the topic, about the description. We would probably, if we think it would be of interest for the journal, we would ask you to write a synopsis. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is the best thing to do is to basically contact us with an idea and see whether we're interested. We might ask you to elaborate on it, to see exactly what do you actually mean, what do you want to put in, and so on. But it will depend a little bit on what we have in the pipeline. So if at the moment, for example, we have quite a lot of perspectives and reviews in the commission. We have we have one under review. And I must say, the one we have two are actually under review, one perspective and one review, they both came unsolicited. They were both proposed by the authors. We've had several, we declined several, but these two we thought they were good. So we just sent them to reviewers, and we have commissioned. So we commissioned them when I started commissioning when I started in January. So the first one that I commissioned will come hopefully in the next few weeks. But of course, if we commission it, it will take time. If we, the ones that were ready to be submitted came, I think, during May. But the best thing, as I was saying, just contact us with an idea, with kind of a description of what you want to do and so on.
Thank you, Fabio. So in the meantime, there are some more questions.
Yeah. So another question from Michael that I can see is about perforated company. Well, yes, of course, there are two big issues. The question is, again, this is something that the journal is very interested in, both PFAS compounds and microplastic contamination, but also I'm very interested also in all types of organic pollution as well, and everything that derives from, for example, from pharmaceuticals, so from medicines that it's led into the environment. But I guess the question is that I've always questioned myself more as an observer how much, for example, plastic is really the level of has the level of importance in terms of the contaminant that we think it has compared to other contaminants, and how much instead is the fact that plastic is so visible that makes it so, that raises public awareness and therefore makes it such a popular field of research. But of course, it is an issue that we have to solve. So those type of compounds, both PFAS and plastic, are two of the big topics at the moment in terms of contaminants, but they're not the only ones. Arsenic, for example, is another big issue in groundwater that I think we should be really interested in. There's this paper, just a quick one, if you don't mind, I reply in Natalia's question about the cover picture. We usually ask for a cover suggestion at the end, like if we accept the paper, we say, when you send the last version of the paper that will actually be published, you're free to submit the covers. Well, actually, we invite people to submit a cover, but there's no guarantee that we'll accept it. But yeah, but I wouldn't say at the beginning. At the beginning is, when you the first submission, it is a long way before we decide to publish the paper. So I don't think it's necessary. There's a question from Q-Mars. Hopefully I don't completely butcher the pronunciation of your name. You want me to elaborate on water treatment. I'm not quite sure what the question is asking. As in, we are definitely interested in both membranes and nanomaterials, but not necessarily only nanomaterials. But of course, eventually all membranes are, to a certain extent, they end up being at the nanoscale. Whether they are nano in terms of they can be considered nanotechnology or not, that's another story. But yes, of course we are, and both reverse osmosis and nanofiltration. And incidentally, I was just at a nanofiltration conference last week, so that's definitely a strong part of our scope. In general, I would say that we are both interested in the development of new membranes, but also about the water treatment at a larger scale. So if we're talking, for example, of system engineering or even economic evaluations of water treatment systems, we would be interested in that as well. And one little comment about this topic is that, especially when I was in Nature Technology, we used to receive a lot of papers, particularly on 2D materials, membranes, and they can be quite interesting, and most of them are interesting. I've always wondered, and I know many people in the community as well wonders this, to what extent these are going to be actually practical. And I'm just saying that in some cases it's a question of of establishing whether actually a paper is important because it provides some new insights, and a lot of these 2D materials membranes papers do. Even if they're not particularly practical. If you listen to some people in the community, they think that the polymer membranes that we have at the moment are probably the best that we are going to get compared to these. But there's a lot of new work on particularly functionalized membranes, on new nanofiltration membranes that might work better with certain new materials. So we are interested in both aspects. That's what I would say.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Fabio. Michael Tam is thanking you for your answers. I also want to join him and thank you very much for your excellent presentation. This was very interesting, very informative, I think, for us, and very good for us to know. Thank you so much for being with us. Hopefully, maybe in the future, we'll be able to meet you in person as well.
I hope so.
As I said, yeah, if you don't mind, send the link to these talks to Julie. You have her email address, I think.
Yes.
Then we can advertise that through our social channels.
Thank you. That'd be great. Yeah.
And
I will also make sure that Nature Water follows your Twitter.
That will be fantastic. Please do.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I think I raised my hand by accident here. Sorry about that.
Don't worry. That sounds very good. Thank you very much, Fabio, for your talk. Thank you to the audience for participating and listening and asking questions. I just want to remind everyone that next week, Tuesday, we have another Water Talk on the 12th of July between 1 and 2 p.m. And we'll have Brian Tolson and his PhD student Ming Hang talk about the Ontario Lake River routing product. And it will be a hybrid session. So it'll be in person in EIT building, room 1015, but you can also follow it online. Thank you all for participating. Fabio, once again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye.
you all. Bye-bye.